Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power, Season 1, Episode 1, A Shadow of the Past, and Season 1, Episode 2, Adrift. This video is the first of many in a series of videos where I review every episode of Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power, so I'll have to start with a spoiler warning for The Rings of Power up to Season 1, Episode 2. If you have not seen all of these episodes, you will not want to watch this video, otherwise some things may be spoiled for you. So, alright, so let me talk about this show, because I'm not a huge, Tolkien, Lord of the Rings fan. Honestly, I hadn't read the books until the movies came out, and I was, in my 20s, I think early 20s, when the Peter Jackson movies came out in the early 2000s. I saw the first movie because my, who I was married to at the time, had read the books, and so she wanted to see the movies, and I was kind of excited for it because it looked like an epic fantasy adventure. And I saw the first movie, and I was like, this is pretty good. But I was really eager to see the second movie, and then I saw the second movie, and by the time I saw the second movie, I was watching the first movie over and over and over and over again, and then I became obsessed, and I watched the first two movies on repeat almost every day, and then the third movie came out, and I went to the premiere showing, in my state, the first showing, the night before, midnight showing, where they showed all three movies, the extended version of the first two movies, and then the premiere of the third movie. That was a lot of fun. I had to line up, stand in line for hours to get tickets for that, and there was people dressed up and yelling and screaming at the screen. It was good fun. Point is, I was a bit obsessed with the movies, and I did go back and read the books, and I read The Hobbit, but I'm not that familiar with, I never read the Silmarillion, and I'm not that familiar with the lore and history of Lord of the Rings, so I'm not that big into the backdrop of it. In fact, the more I hear about it, the more it sounds like mythology, religion is a bit I don't know if ridiculous applies, but it's myths. And I get less interested in that aspect of it because it gets more grandiose the further back in the history you get. So the reason why I bring this up is because it seems like a lot of people who are familiar with Tolkien's work and all of the histories and backstory don't like the show and have a bone to pick with the show and hate it because apparently, from what I hear, Amazon do not have the rights to any of these other works like the Silmarillion, other books that Tolkien wrote. They only have the rights to Lord of the Rings and the appendices in Lord of the Rings. So apparently some people think that the show is kind of going against what it's established but from what I understand, they're kind of skirting around it, and they're making up basically their own thing, but inserting it into the established history. So they're I guess they're not doing the best job because some scholars of Tolkien take issue with it, but for the most part they seem to be trying to stay true to established history, but playing in this little area that hasn't been really established and kind of making up their own shit. And to be clear, I got zero issue with this because, as I said, I am not a Tolkien scholar history. I don't really know anything about the extended lore and history, and people throw shit at me like the Numenor and Morgoth and shit like that, and I got no clue what they're talking about. Although I got a bit more of a clue from watching these episodes because I did a little bit of research. But before then, I didn't know any of that shit. Now, so I don't have a problem with that. I could understand why those who are more steeped in the lore might, because if, for example, they do a Star Trek show and they kind of fuck up canon all right and left, then I might have a bit of an issue. By the way, I don't think any newer Star Trek shows has Voyager. I probably think is most guilty of this. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. Point is, I would be more sensitive on something I'm more familiar with, but I'm just not that familiar with this, so it doesn't bother me personally. And as I said, I loved the movies. In fact, most Tolkien fans would find me I say heresy, because I actually prefer the movies to the novels, because that was my first introduction to Lord of the Rings, was the Peter Jackson movies, and I read the books. Retrospecting, honestly, the books read more like I wouldn't say history book, but they're kind of gab. I don't know. It's kind of like the royalty, and it's more formal, where Peter Jackson put a lot of emotion and heart into those movies. And again, yes, as I know, most Tolkien scholars would say what I'm saying is heresy and gibberish, but this is where I'm coming from, just to explain. So staying true to Tolkien and all that things, not a concern for me. Now, I will say, when I heard about this show, and I heard about Game of Thrones prequel House of the Dragon, and that they were going to be released simultaneously in the months building up to this, and I've been on record saying I was more anticipating a Lord of the Rings show than House of the Dragon. A lot of that had to do with the horribleness of the last 2 seasons of Game of Thrones. Now, granted, the Hobbit movies were also terrible, but to me, the Hobbit movies weren't as bad as season 8 of Game of Thrones, season 7 and 8 of Game of Thrones, and they didn't kind of in retrospect ruin the Lord of the Rings movies the way I feel like season 7 and 8 of Game of Thrones kind of ruined the entire show, because the whole show was building to something, and it's building to something that was written so terribly, so it makes it hard for me to watch earlier seasons of the show, where I can go back and watch the Lord of the Rings movies, and those Hobbit movies don't interfere with my enjoyment of them at all. Now, so I was really looking forward to this Lord of the Rings show more so than House of the Dragon. But after seeing the first 2 episodes of this show and the first 2 episodes of House of the Dragon, kind of think House of the Dragon's better. Which surprises me. But I actually think that House of the Dragon, I'm more intrigued, I'm more interested. I think the characters are more fleshed out, and I'm just more engulfed in that world, and I want to see, I'm on the edge of my seat to see what happens next in House of the Dragon. Whereas this show, I'm not really on the edge of my seat, but I'm like, this is interesting. This could be building to something great, but I kind of want to see where they're going with this. And this is what I will say. A lot of the reviews I've been seeing on the first 2 episodes of The Rings of Power have been a lukewarm to negative. I think there was a couple positive reviews out there, so maybe overall the reception of these first 2 episodes are mixed, but I have seen a lot of negative reviews, a lot of meh reviews, a lot of people saying, it's kind of boring, it was mostly exposition, or you got the Tolkien purists saying, they're fucking up, the lore or whatever, and people saying, that's really silly, or this is boring, and the dialogue is terrible. The dialogue to me is very consistent with Lord of the Rings. It's just, you can't really compare it to sort of modern works. It's kind of meant to be all silly like that. So I gotta take it with that grain of salt. So I disagree. I disagree with this. I think the majority of critics are being too harsh, or not even just critics, just people watching the show. I think the majority are being too harsh and judging it before it really has a chance to pick up. Now, that being said, if we get to the end of the first season and it hasn't really improved much and it's still kind of bland, then I'll concede that they were right and they saw the direction they're going to. But honestly, I think the second episode was picking up steam, and I could see this getting better and better. I could see this laying the groundwork for a really interesting story. And the thing for me is, as I was watching these episodes, is I kept, it helped me, immediately after watching these episodes, I wanted to go watch some videos about the lore and where exactly this is like taking place, because it's hard for me to place this because I don't know much about the history of Lord of the Rings. But when they said this was kind of at the start of the Second Age, I was like, okay, so that's a long fucking time. Because I told someone it was like hundreds of years before Lord of the Rings. No, actually, it's thousands of years before Lord of the Rings, which is a long fucking time. And so yeah, once I got an idea of where it was taking place, when it was taking place, that sort of helped my mindset that this is a long ass time ago. In fact, they said that the prologue shown at the very start of Lord of the Rings, where they show the huge battle with Elrond and Sauron, and then what's his face? Isildur takes the ring, and Elrond's like, force it into the fire, and he's like, no. Like, so that apparently is probably going to be like the big finale of this entire show. So what this show is like both taking place shortly before that and kind of leading up to that. So that helps me kind of place this in my mind, what the hell is going on. So I think that people were a bit harsh on it. I don't think it's that bad, but as I said, I think House of the Dragon does a much better job of telling a prequel history, and making, and from the start getting me interested in these characters, from the start getting me invested in the world. We're here, like, I heard people say, "Oh, these characters were boring." I don't think they're boring, except for the Half-Foot storyline. So, the Galadriel I thought was an interesting character. I was very interested in her storyline. I thought they did a good job of setting the stage, and I think it kind of makes sense this would be an early version of Galadriel, because as we see her in Lord of the Rings, she's kind of an outcast, just living in the forest, and practically seen as like a witch or something, has all these magical powers. And so I kind of seeing how this is like setting the stage for that, how she's like still towing the line at the stage but starting to break away, and that she's being driven by this need of revenge and love for her brother. I think I really attached to that. I think that's extremely strong, and I love the actress they got to play her. I think she does an outstanding job as Galadriel. So all that I'm 100% on board with. We get the storyline with Elrond. That for me, that's what was slow. At first I was like, I don't know if I really buy this as Elrond, but then when we got into the second episode, then I started to see it more and to pick up on it and be more interested in, particularly the storyline when he goes to the Dwarven Hall and he's like, "Oh, tell my friend, your friend Elrond's there," and like, "Nah, go away, fuck off." And he has to, and doesn't realize like how this dwarf is hurt by the fact that he hadn't talked to him in 20 years, but 20 years for Elrond is like the blink of an eye. And I loved it, and I love the scenes with Elrond and the dwarf, and how they went to dinner and met his wife, and those are just the chemistry, the character. I think these were really well written scenes. That's why I disagree with people saying that it's not, the dialogue's written poorly. I think that's hogwash. I think, in particularly looking at these scenes, it's this strong chemistry between the characters. It was fun. I was invested. I was emotionally invested. All that stuff was really good for me. Now the storyline going down on the south with, I can't even remember their names. There was an elf there who was in love with this human woman who's a healer, and they get the forbidden love storyline, which is kind of a cliche. And how the elves apparently, and I didn't get this from the episode, I had to watch videos afterwards that explained it, that these particular men sided with Morgoth in the previous wars, and so they're kind of occupied by the elves to make sure they don't get in trouble. But one of the elves explains, like, look, this, we're not watching over them because they sided with the enemy. We're watching over them because they're kind of shady right now. Like they need to be watched over, and how they're kind of hold this resentment towards the elves. So I find that somewhat interesting. The forbidden love aspect is kind of a cliche, but then I think they kind of earn it a bit with these two, a little bit. I think maybe sometimes they push it on too strong, but so this story I think is fine. Like I think they need to build this a bit more. I'm a bit lukewarm on it at the moment. Um, but it's obviously building to something. They travel to a nearby town. They see it's destroyed, and there's orcs everywhere. And her son is finding this like self-repairing sword with the Sauron mark on it. So that's this again. So that's what I'm saying is setting the seeds for something more interesting to come. So I'm kind of okay. Like this is kind of mediocre for me at the moment, but it has potential to rise above that. I can see the potential. Um, I'm trying to think what other storylines. As I said, we have the storylines with the Half-Woods, which I really don't care about. Like, this is supposed to be a predecessor to the Hobbits, and I think someone mentions even supposed to be Smeagol's people, where he came from, the type of person he was. And I don't know, I just don't care about these characters that much. Like the little girl going out and defying, and I don't know. These characters I find them a little annoying too. I guess I'm wasn't that huge into hobbits, and these people I like even less. And then you had the the mystery about the Meteor Man, who crashed, and we don't know who this is, and apparently he has magical powers, and he draws the fire in him. And so this is the big mystery. People were saying, well, who's this? Is this Sauron? Is this Gandalf? Is it some other wizard? So they're creating this mystery. So I hope the payoff for this is interesting. And so again, if they focus more, he's definitely the most interesting thing about that Half-Foot storyline, because I don't care about this damn Half-Foots. So if they focus more on him and his sort of maybe him and I think Nori is the name of the little girl. I can't remember. But they go off on an adventure and focus more on that, and we find out who this person is. I could potentially see this being a little more interesting. And so yeah, so there is something that this show's done, which I really noticed in the first two episodes, talking about a more stylistic viewpoint, is they kept doing these scenes where they would intercut between scenes and try to, like, if something was about to explode in one scene, you see something falling like in a different storyline. Like they intercut it in a way, and sometimes the music I found was kind of artificially trying to create tension, and I noticed, which is always a bad thing, because when you're watching a movie or a show, the music should not be something that is on the forefront of your mind. It should enhance the story. You should be so engulfed with the story that you kind of only partly register the music as an enhancement of the story, not saying, oh, well, it's obvious they want me to feel this because the music is really overbearing and trying to tell me to feel this. And I did kind of get that a couple times in these first two episodes. And also, like, yeah, I think they overdid it with the stylized intercut from one storyline to another to try to make it blend together, or like try to fake you out, or try to build the tension between them. And like, for example, the comet scene when it was falling, they intercut that with Galadriel jumping off the ship, and they tried to like edit it together so it kind of like worked in conjunction with each other. Most of the times I would find that interesting, but for me, I think they did it too much in these first two episodes, and I found it a bit actually threw me out of the story a bit, that they were, because it felt artificial, that they were artificially trying to link these stories together, which weren't in fact linked. I'm thinking of the movie Cloud Atlas, which is a totally underrated, underappreciated movie that I think does a beautiful job of actually doing what they tried to do of intercutting different storylines, but making it fit together and create the right attention together. With this, I didn't think it really accomplished that as well. But of course, I got to talk about everyone's talking about the cinematography and how beautiful the show looks, the special effects, the scenery, the sets, everything. Of course, it's the most expensive show of all time to this point, apparently. So of course, we're gonna know it's gonna look beautiful, and it does look, I would say, just as beautiful as the Lord of the Rings films. Of course, it's updated with updated technology, so it looks even better. And to me, that's that's great. I love that this helped me get involved in the world. But for me, that's not the whole point. The whole point is the story. And if they can't pull the story together, and having a beautifully, it's kind of like Game of Thrones season 8, where was beautifully acted and the special effects were beautiful and the cinematography was beautiful, but the story was shit, so none of that other stuff actually mattered. Whereas here, the story isn't shit. It's just building. Like, they need to get it somewhere. Now, here's a question. Something I've heard some people say, that that this is just a generic fantasy story, and the only reason why people watch it and make a big deal out of it because it's got the Lord of the Rings name of it, but really it's no better than any average generic fantasy story. And I actually very strongly disagree with that. I just compared it to House of the Dragon and said that I like House of the Dragon better, but if I compare it to other shows like, say, The Witcher, I think this is way better than The Witcher. Now, granted, I have a much lower view of The Witcher than most people do, because I stopped watching that show. I didn't like it so much that I just gave up on it before I even finished the first season, because I wasn't that interested in the first place. I was like, I don't know, we'll see what's going. But as soon as they introduced a stupid fucking minstrel who annoyed the hell out of me, I just couldn't do it anymore. I just had to stop that show altogether, because fuck that guy. Just fuck him. It's just, if I was interested enough to show, if I thought this was a great show and I was so interested to see what's happening, I would probably put up with the minstrel. But because it just wasn't working for me, the minstrel's like, nah, you don't want me to watch this show. So I think this show is definitely way better than that, because I'm interested, I'm hooked, I want to see where they're going. I can see a lot of potential for where this show might go, whereas Witcher, I didn't give a fuck, and it wasn't enough for me to sit through that fucking minstrel. And then when I compared a lot to the Wheel of Time, that's kind of a different story. In that case, I kind of do feel like the only reason I like this better than The Wheel of Time, which I do, but the only reason I do is because of the Lord of the Rings name. Because I think if you take the Lord of the Rings name out of it, I kind of think they're on par. They're probably somewhere on par. In fact, it's very similar, like the way they introduced the orcs and whatnot. I can't remember what they call them in Wheel of Time. They don't call them orcs, but they're essentially orcs. But anyway, so that there's kind of similar. But the reason why I'm more interested in this is not just because it has Lord of the Rings name on it, but because I know it's going to tie into the greater mythology and history of Lord of the Rings. So that makes me more interested to see what they do with it. That makes me feel like it has more potential, because this whole story about the Rings of Power and Sauron, and so it could tie into a greater mythology. So for me, that's kind of different than just saying, well, this has the franchise name that I like, and therefore I'm biased toward it. I think it's definitely more than that. But yeah, if this didn't have the franchise name, it was just generic sci-fi, then I would probably say it's on par with The Wheel of Time. His Dark Materials, this is definitely better than that, I believe. I don't know. I don't know how well of an adaptation His Dark Materials is, but I just only kind of interested in it. Like, if they threw in an annoying minstrel in that show, I might give up on that show too. But they never did, so I'm just kind of halfway there with his Dark Materials, which I think was canceled. I don't know, maybe it wasn't, I don't know. But anyway, maybe it was. I think they're doing a third season and it's been canceled. I can't remember. Maybe I'm totally wrong. Don't quote me on this. Maybe it's not canceled at all. Point is, I think I like this show much better than that. Even if you take the Lord of the Rings name out of it, I think I'm more interested to see what happens here because like the interactions with Elrond and the dwarf, like I thought there was some golden stuff, like Galadriel's character story. I'm totally invested in the stuff with the elf hanging out with the human healers. Yeah, it's okay. As I said, it has potential, so it could go somewhere. And even the half-foot things, which I think would annoy the fuck out of me, could get better because they're going to focus more on Meteor Man. And that's really an interesting mystery that they set up. Now, I want to talk more about episode 2 because I don't know. It is a bit silly to think that Galadriel jumped off the ship and basically in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, the equivalent does, and she's expecting like being like almost to North America and then jumping off the ship and trying to swim back to England. Like, this is a fantasy show, I get it, and she's an elf, a mortal being, I get it, but still, that's a bit crazy. That was a bit too much for me, and maybe I get some Tolkien scholars saying, well, actually the distance isn't that wide. It's not as long as between the land. I don't give a fuck. It's still, that's not my point. The point is it's a vast fucking difference. And I think that was, that was a bit ridiculous. And then it's funny that episode 2 was called Adrift because I didn't realize this as I was watching the episode because I kept thinking that this reminded me a lot of this episode from Lost. Well, particularly the story, not the whole episode, but the storyline with Galadriel and she ends up on this raft or whatever. It was the remains of a ship where these, human survivors were, and they all get killed by the serpent except for this one hot dude. And I was thinking, and especially when she was hanging out with the dude and sort of trying to talk and form a bond, but they don't really like each other, I was thinking, this reminds me a lot of this episode of Lost, where Sawyer and Michael are hanging out in the pits of the raft after it's been bombed and destroyed, and they're like kind of just floating back to shore, and they're arguing with each other and revealing their characters or whatever while there's a shark in the water trying to kill them. And then I realized this episode's called Adrift, which was the exact same name that the Lost episode had, Adrift. Now, the Lost episode is one of my least favorite episodes of Lost. I thought it was boring as fuck and mostly just unnecessary filler. This one, as I said, not as bad. Even the Galadriel storyline, not as bad because it's obviously getting into her character more. I did find it a little hard to follow why, how those other people died and how that one dude just happened to survive, and then Galadriel is kind of giving him shit for letting everyone else die, but I didn't really get how he did that or how he survived or what was going on, so that was a bit confusing for me. I don't know. But yeah, I mean, and then we had the Anori, I guess her name is, trying to make friends with the Meteor Man, and how he's like arranging fireflies in the sky and trying to talk. When they were trying to talk and she was giving him food and he was eating it wrong, like, I got a sense of deja vu because I've seen scenes like that fucking billions of times. So again, not the hugest biggest fan of the half-foot storyline. But I fucking love the whole dwarf thing with Elrond, gotta say. Anyway, I think I'm kind of repeating myself now. I think I pretty much touched on everything that I wanted to touch on. So, my rating for episodes 1 and 2 of season 1 of The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power, I think I'm going to give this an 8. I was kind of an 8. Extremely good because I was kind of torn between a 7 and an 8, but again, the stuff like the Galadriel storyline, which I think was pretty fucking strong, and the beautiful like scenery and cinematography, and the whole Elrond hanging out with the dwarves, which again I can't understate how much I love that. That pushes this up from an 8, from a 7 to an 8, but it's a low 8, but still. Because yeah, as I said, this I think people were too harsh on the first two episodes. I don't think it was boring, but it's definitely didn't grab me the way something like say House of the Dragon is, and it is much more of a slow burn, and I gotta see that but it has me intrigued to see what it's building for, was building to, yeah, so 8 out of 10 for me. So that's it for my review of the first two episodes of Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power. Be sure to check back here every week as I continue to cover this show. Also check out my channel as I cover other shows such as House of the Dragon and Star Trek Lower Decks, and in fact all things Star Trek and much more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all that, and thanks a lot for watching.